Hi everyone, my name is Maddie, welcome back to my channel and welcome to my mid-year stats and updated reading goals video. So with it being just past halfway through the year, I thought it'd be really fun to just talk through some really in-depth stats about what I've been reading in the first 6 months of the year, especially in comparison to how I was reading it the first half of last year. I track a whole load of stats. I have a big reading spreadsheet. I actually have a whole video about how I track my reading if you want to check it out. But I track a whole load of stats and I love them. So I thought it'd be really interesting to look back and kind of reflect on what I've been reading and also talk about my reading goals for the rest of the year. I set reading goals myself at the beginning of the year, but obviously I wasn't doing YouTube then, so you guys don't know about them. And also they have changed a bit throughout the course of the first 6 months. So I thought it'd be a good time to sort of update them and let you know what I'm planning to read for the next 6 months of the year. So I'm going to jump straight in with my stats. It's all very low tech on pieces of paper. I track it all properly on a nice spreadsheet, but I just added it all up and made myself notes on paper, so that's what we're going with. But to jump straight in, the first thing is obviously how many books I've read so far this year. So as of the end of June, which is when all these stats will be going to, even though it's partway through July now, I had read 56 books, which I am super happy with. My goal for the year was 72, so I'm so unbelievably on track for that. But in comparison to last year, it was actually a really big improvement. By this point last year, I had read 35 books. So I've read more than 20 more, which is huge and brilliant. But I will say that last year, I really didn't read at the beginning of the year and then massively got into it in the second half. So if I keep continuing to read at the pace I'm currently reading, I will actually end up at an extremely similar point to last year. Because at the end of last year, I had read 108 books, and if I continue at the rate I'm currently reading, it'll be about 112 this year. So it's actually not too dissimilar. Just last year was much less consistent with how much I was reading. But with the number of books I've read so far this year, that puts my average at 9.3 books per month, which is actually much lower than I thought it would be, as I always say that I average reading about 10 books a month, and that's what I aim for. But I did have a really bad couple of reading months when I got into a really bad slump right towards the end of my degree and COVID and everything going on. So I'm not overly surprised that it's a little bit lower than I expected, but I'm definitely getting that above double digits before the end of the year if I can. But I will include a graph here which shows the difference between how much I was reading each month last year and this year, with last year the line being turquoise and this year being yellow. But it is also worth noting the difference in page count between the 2 years, because that obviously shows quite a lot as well. So this year I read 18,345 pages so far, whereas last year I'd read 12,712. So although I'd read far less books last year, the page count wasn't actually as different as you might expect. And this is simply because obviously I was reading slightly longer books last year. So on that, my average length of book that I've read so far this year is 328 pages, whereas last year it was 362. So I was certainly reading longer books last year, but not that dramatically different. And I also know because I'd read less books, I had a couple of long ones at the beginning of last year, it obviously brings the average up quite significantly. So that's just a quick overview of how much I'd read by the same points in the year, but I do think it's quite interesting to get into what sort of things I've been reading, as that's actually really quite indicative of why these numbers are quite different. I actually thought I would have read less books at this time this year, as this year I really set out to read a lot more adult books and slightly more hard-hitting books that would probably take me longer to read. I also had my final year of uni, so I thought I'd be really behind, but obviously I seem to be getting through them. This also explains the change in length of the books, as adult contemporary often tend to be much shorter books than books such as YA fantasy, which is much more what I was reading last year. Another thing I find really interesting is the difference in star ratings I've given this year versus last year. I, at the beginning of this year, massively rethought my star rating system. If you want a video on how I actually rate my books, then I would love to do that, but just let me know down in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in. But I massively rejigged my system, because I remember when I got to the end of the last year and reflected on my stats, I had almost 40 or 50% 5-star books, which to me felt really wrong, because I could maybe only pick out 10 out of about 100 books which were absolute favourites, so it felt really wrong for me to have given that many books 5 stars. And I still give more books 5 stars now than, well, like all-time favourites, but I'm more selective about what I give that, and therefore my whole rating system has sort of moved down one notch. Also last year, I was massively afraid to give a book a 3-star. 3-star felt really harsh to me, whereas now I've sort of accepted that 3-star or even 3.5 is really just quite an average book. 2 starts to feel like I really didn't enjoy it. But that can just be a sort of, it was okay, it didn't really impact me that much, so I'm just going to give it a 3. But I will just say, before we get into the detail of the numbers, I do still have a much higher average rating than most people, and I do rate my books quite highly. And a lot of people think this is just because I sort of give high numbers to everything, and to an extent, maybe I do. but I'm also extremely selective about what books I read. I will only buy a book or pick up a book if it's really what I want to read in that moment and just in general. I am very, very picky, and I think just because I don't read like too much, it's quite easy for me to be picky about what I read. There's enough books out there for me to really think about if it's one I want to read and think I will enjoy before picking it up. And I think that really results in my average rating being higher, as I'm more likely to give a book a higher rating. I also do know my reading taste pretty well, so it's quite easy for me to pick books which I will rate highly, though I'm not always right, as is evidenced by some low ratings. But just to break it down a little bit, so far this year I have had 3 2-star books, 13 3-star books, 35 4-star books, and then 10 5-star books. I will say that if I give something, for example, a 3.5, I am counting that within the 3s, or if I give something a 4.5, I'm counting that within the 4s. It's just how I do it, because I do quite often give half-star ratings. So it is definitely evident that my average rating is still, very near to 4. My average is actually 3.8, which is high for a lot of people. But compared to last year, where I think it was well over 4, my average rating, this feels much more correct to me. I feel like I am reading good books overall, so it makes sense for me to be giving them about a 4-star quite frequently. But I haven't had too many which were absolutely phenomenal, but also haven't had too many which were really awful. But just to compare that to last year, by this point last year, I had given 20 books 5-star, 9 books 4-star, 5 3-stars, and 1 2-star. So yeah, I was so generous with the 5 stars, and some of those books are all-time favorites, I can't deny that. But by the end of the year, I'd already started giving a few less 5 stars, and I really have this year brought that down to a more comfortable level for me. I mentioned earlier that something that I was really focusing on this year was reading more books aimed at adults. I love YA, I will always love YA, but I did find it was starting to feel slightly repetitive and slightly less interesting to me. And I'd had a few adult books which absolutely stood out and really I loved, so I was like, maybe I should just start making that transition to reading more adult books, and then if I ever want to move back, I always can. And I've definitely followed through on that. I actually didn't realise how I had been reading majority adult books this year. I will say that a lot of the books I class as adult will obviously have crossover appeal to YA readers. It's really difficult to give an exact age rating for most books, because you can have a book which is really dark and feels like an adult book but follows a young character, or vice versa. And so I've tried to look these up where I can, but I've also slightly just gone off what I feel like they should be aimed towards. So just to break down the intended age range of the books I've been reading so far this year, or like the intended audience, I have read 36 books which were probably aimed at adults, I've read 15 books which were aimed at young adults, and then 5 which were middle grade. So I very rarely read middle grade, but all of those books are my reread of Percy Jackson that I did. So it's definitely not a genre I tend to pick up, or an age range I tend to pick up, but I did reread the Percy Jackson series, hence why I do have a small proportion of middle grade this year. But this does put the amount of adult books I've read so far this year at almost 65%, which is huge in comparison to last year, where the amount of adult books I read was only 17%. So obviously that is a huge difference. I've really geared my reading towards adult this year, whereas last year I was reading vast majority YA. And again, I'll say it again, I have nothing against YA books. I love them. Some of my favourite books ever are YA, and I'm sure I will continue to find new favourites within that age range. But for now, I'm just feeling more gripped by a lot of adult books, so that's what I'm choosing to pick up. So another quick little stat which I track literally just for fun, I just enjoy seeing it, is how many books I read have LGBT representation in them. And again, this is slightly hard to count, because if it's a really, really small side character that it's really not part of the story, then I'm not necessarily counting it. This is more main characters, or it's a plot line, or it's just really quite present in the book. And I simply track this because I've said a million times, and I will say again, I will always pick up LGBT books. I love them, they make me really happy. So I was just intrigued to see how many of the books I read actually are LGBT, because it feels like it's a lot, so I wanted to see if it actually was. And it is quite a lot. It's not as much as I expected, but 50%, exactly 50% of the books I've read this year feature really prominent LGBT rep. There are definitely others, such as the Dark Shade of Magic trilogy, which I read this year, which have LGBT rep in them, but it didn't feel either like a focus or a prominent part to me, and so I didn't class that within this category. Last year actually wasn't dissimilar. By this point last year, I had read 20 non-LGBT books and 15 that were, so slightly, but not a huge difference. Either way, I'm just really happy that I'm picking up so many LGBT books, and I'm going to continue to do so. I don't track this to make sure I'm reading them. I'm going to choose to pick them up. That's not going to change. So it's just out of interest really, and I thought I would share it. So then the final thing I've really tracked is the genre of the books I've been reading, and sorry if I start looking down at my notes for this one, it's a long list of genres with a lot of numbers, so I don't think I'm going to get it off the top of my head. But unsurprisingly, this year the majority of the books I've read have been fantasy. That's not surprising to me, and it's probably not surprising to you. I love fantasy books, I go on about it all the time, and so it's unsurprising that a lot of the books I tend to pick up are fantasy. And then again, not too surprisingly, that's followed quite closely by contemporary, a lot of which would have been YA contemporary or even hard-hitting stories. But that, again, is not remotely surprising to me. Those definitely tend to be the two genres I would pick up the most or lean towards the most. So far this year, I have read 36 fantasy novels, 18 contemporary novels, 7 sci-fi or sort of speculative dystopian. I lump a lot of things into sci-fi, but I've read 7 of those novels. And then I have read 1 romance book, 1 non-fiction book, 1 poetry book, and 1 anthology. I could probably lump those in together a bit, but I wasn't sure how to split them up, so that's sort of where I'm putting them. But in terms of what genres I've assigned books to, it's often really hard, so I have a lot which is sort of contemporary romance, but if it's not a dedicated romance book, I tend to put it in contemporary. But then there's books such as Fortuna Sworn, which is fantasy romance, and the romance is quite a lot of the focus, but I've put it into fantasy because it feels more fantasy to me. So the genres are slightly subjective, and when I actually have them on my spreadsheet, I have a lot of things put into 2 or 3 genres, but for this I just wanted to sort of choose the most prominent one and go with it. Again, this isn't too dissimilar from last year, however the genres of contemporary and fantasy had switched. I had read more contemporary and very slightly less fantasy. So at this point last year, I had read 14 contemporary books, 9 fantasy books, 5 sci-fi books, 3 romance books, 1 anthology, and 1 thriller. So it's not particularly different, there's a few other bits coming and going, but overall I read fantasy and I read contemporary. That's not going to change, that's just the books I enjoy, but I read not necessarily an even split of them, but it comes and goes regarding which one I've read most of, and I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the year contemporary's made a bit of a comeback, because I tend to read a lot of contemporary during summer. And although summer is kind of almost over in the UK, I still feel summery-ish until like maybe August, September. So we'll just see. It's also just what I'm feeling like at the time. Sometimes I'm massively into one thing, sometimes I'm massively into another. But it's fantasy and contemporary mainly. So that's pretty much it for the stats I wanted to talk about, but I just quickly wanted to talk you through my reading goals for the rest of this year. So I mentioned at the beginning that my goal for the year was to read 72 books, and that was set because I thought I'd be reading more adult, which might take me longer, and also I had a uni degree to finish, and I thought I'd be starting my grad job in September, and so I just thought there's going to be a lot going on this year, I'm not going to set my goal too high. But I'm so close to that goal already, and actually my grad job's not starting till February, so I have the rest of the year to read lots. So I'm sort of unofficially upping my goal. I mean, I can officially up it to 100. I may not change it on Goodreads, but I can say that I'm aiming for 100 books. But I'm honestly aiming higher. I would really like to beat what I hit last year, which was 108, which should be doable, but I'm not going to put too much pressure on it. I'm not too stressed. If I hit 100, I'll be thrilled. Anything above that is a bonus. If I can beat last year, fantastic. But I don't want to start falling into the trap of trying to beat my goal every year, because the year where I'm starting my job, or if I've got a lot going on, all of a sudden I'm going to not be able to do it and get annoyed about it. So I'm not going to put too much pressure on that. 100 would be nice, but if I hit 72, I've technically hit my goal and I'm not going to complain. Another reading goal I set myself, as I've already mentioned, was to read lots of adult books, which I've already been doing and absolutely will continue to do, so that's not really updating particularly. I would really like to try and read some more adult fantasy. I'm finding I'm reading a lot of adult contemporary, but still sort of veering towards some YA fantasy. I love adult fantasy and I do read some of it, but it's still the one thing I find very intimidating. So I would really like to try and make myself read some more of that. So the other 2 goals I set myself at the beginning of the year was a list of difficult books I wanted to get to and a list of series I wanted to get to. And it is safe to say I am not doing too well with these. So the series I really wanted to try and read this year were The Bone Season, A Darker Shade of Magic, Court of Thorns and Roses, Truthwitch and Mistborn. Those were the 5 series I was really determined to get to. I have read A Darker Shade of Magic, I've read all 3 books, I read the first book in the Court of Thorns and Roses series, I have not touched the rest. Mistborn I'm still very determined to do. The Bone Season I would like to, but I'm considering waiting till closer to the release of the 4th book so that I'm sort of ready for when that comes out. Truthwitch I don't know, I'm kind of feeling it, we'll see if I get to it, and I'm going to continue with ACOTAR, I swear I'm going to do it. But I don't think I'm going to add any series to this, and I'm also not too stressed about this goal. Like, if I get it, that would be lovely, but I've been really enjoying a lot of standalones this year instead of series, which is strange for me, but I'm kind of going to go with it. If I'm enjoying it, we're going to go with it. However, Mistborn and ACOTAR, I will read both of those series by the end of the year. I hope. I really want to try and get to them. But I did mention I also made a list of books I specifically wanted to get to, and I have got to exactly 0 of those. I'm not doing well with this goal. Some of them I'm still determined to do. I would still really like to read The Great Gatsby this year, as it is now the 20s. Again, it felt appropriate. I'm determined to try and read Dracula in October, as it feels very Halloween-y. I'm still quite determined to read A Little Life, but the rest of the books on that list, I'm kind of just going to let go. I think if I get to them, brilliant, but I think this year needs to be a fun year of reading, as it's been a bit of a weird year already, and maybe I can focus on reading some of these other books another time. But other than that, I don't have too many goals. I'm really enjoying at the moment just setting myself a small TBR each month and trying to stick to that so that I can make sure I'm trying to get to books I wouldn't necessarily be top of my pile, because otherwise I just end up reading new releases the whole time. But I think it's working out nicely that I'm reading a good mix of books I'm dying to read and have been really wanting to read for a while that have just come out, versus ones that have been on my shelves for a long time, and some that are more challenging, some that are super easy and fun. But I'm quite happy with the mix I'm having, so I'm not going to be too stressed about setting myself goals for the next half of the year. I'm just going to keep reading like I am, keep mood reading, enjoying reading, and making the most of the time I have at the moment before I go into the world of work and get super, super busy. And that's about it. So I think that is it for this video, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please leave it a thumbs up and subscribe if you'd like to see more content from me. Comment below some of your reading goals and whether you're managing to hit them. I love seeing what other people are planning to achieve or trying to work towards. But that is it, so bye, and I'll see you in the next one.